The old Victorian house on Maple Street looked exactly the same as it did 20 years ago, down to the peeling green paint on the shutters and the crooked mailbox that Grandpa never bothered to fix. I stood on the cracked sidewalk, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the brass key John had given me that morning. "Just go through Grandma's things," he'd said, his voice unusually tight. "Take whatever you want before we put the house on the market." But there was something in his eyes that didn't match his casual tone. Something that made my stomach twist with an unease I couldn't quite name. The autumn wind whipped through my hair, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and memories I'd tried so hard to bury. Walking up those familiar stone steps felt like stepping back in time, each creak of the old wood beneath my feet echoing with the laughter of children who no longer existed. I was 8 years old again, racing up these same steps with James and John, our voices carrying across the neighborhood as we played hide-and-seek in Grandma's sprawling house. But now, at 32, I felt the weight of adulthood pressing down on my shoulders like a heavy coat. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been waiting for me all these years. As the door swung open, the familiar smell of lavender and old books washed over me, bringing tears to my eyes that I quickly wiped away. The living room was exactly as Grandma had left it before she passed last month, her reading glasses still folded neatly on the side table, her favorite mystery novel bookmarked halfway through. I ran my fingers along the worn fabric of her armchair, remembering how she used to pull me onto her lap and read me stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms. Those were simpler times, when the biggest worry in my life was whether I'd get chocolate chip cookies after dinner. Now, as a mother myself, I understood the weight of protecting innocence, of shielding the people you love from truths that could shatter their world. The silence in the house felt heavy, pregnant with secrets that seemed to whisper from every corner. I was carefully wrapping Grandma's china teacups in newspaper when I heard the front door slam shut, followed by familiar footsteps on the hardwood floor. "Mary?" James's voice called out, but there was an edge to it that made me pause. He appeared in the doorway moments later, his usually easy smile replaced by something that looked almost like panic. At 29, my cousin had always been the restless one in our family, the one who couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes without finding some new adventure or mischief to get into. But today, his nervous energy seemed different, more urgent, like a caged animal looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, running his hand through his dark hair in a gesture I recognized from our childhood. It was the same thing he used to do when he'd broken something and was trying to figure out how to explain it to the adults. His eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting mine, and I noticed the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as if he was fighting some internal battle. "John said you were coming by, but I thought it would be later." There was something forced about his casual tone, something that reminded me of the time he'd tried to convince Grandma that the broken vase in the hallway had fallen by itself. Even as children, James had never been a good liar. "I wanted to get an early start," I replied, studying his face carefully. "There's so much to go through, and I know how hard this is for all of us." The words felt hollow even as I spoke them, because the truth was that something felt wrong about this whole situation. John's insistence that I come alone, the way he'd avoided my eyes when he handed me the key, and now James's obvious discomfort. It all added up to something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I'd learned to trust my instincts over the years, especially after my divorce when I'd ignored too many red flags for too long. The same alarm bells that had warned me about my ex-husband were ringing now, loud and clear. James moved closer, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, and I caught a whiff of cigarettes and something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "Listen, Mary," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "There are some areas of the house that are, well, they're not safe. The basement stairs are rotting, and there's probably mold down there. You really shouldn't go exploring on your own." His words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like he'd rehearsed them but couldn't quite get them right. The way he emphasized "shouldn't" made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a warning, or maybe even a threat. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. "You don't want to see this," he added quietly, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. It wasn't concern for my safety. It was something deeper, more desperate. The James I knew from childhood had been mischievous and wild, but never secretive, never afraid. This man standing before me with his haunted eyes and trembling hands was someone I barely recognized. As he spoke, I noticed him glancing repeatedly toward the kitchen, where I knew the basement door was located. Whatever was down there, whatever he was so desperate to keep me from seeing, I suddenly knew with absolute certainty that I had to find out what it was. The truth, whatever it might be, was calling to me from the depths of my grandmother's house. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as James and I stood there, neither of us willing to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled between us. I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, each sound echoing through the house like a heartbeat. My cousin's eyes kept darting toward the kitchen, and I found myself following his gaze, wondering what could possibly be so terrible that he felt the need to warn me away. Growing up, we'd explored every inch of this house together. The dusty attic with its treasure trove of old photographs, the secret compartment behind the bookshelf in the study, even the creepy crawl space under the front porch. But I couldn't remember ever being told to stay away from the basement. "James," I said carefully, setting down the teacup I'd been holding, "what's really going on here?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but inside my heart was racing like a hummingbird's wings. The way he flinched at my question told me everything I needed to know. Whatever secret he was guarding, it was big enough to make him physically uncomfortable. I'd seen that same look on my 7-year-old daughter's face when she'd tried to hide the fact that she'd broken my favorite lamp. But this wasn't about a broken piece of china or a childhood accident. This was something that had the power to make a grown man shake with fear. Before James could answer, the sound of a car door slamming outside made us both jump. Through the lace curtains, I could see John's familiar blue sedan parked in the driveway, and my heart sank as I realized that whatever conversation James and I might have had was about to be interrupted. My older brother had always been the responsible one, the peacekeeper who smoothed over family conflicts and made sure everyone got along. But lately, there had been something different about him, a distance that I couldn't quite bridge no matter how hard I tried. When he'd called to tell me about Grandma's passing, his voice had been flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script rather than sharing the news of our beloved grandmother's death. John's footsteps on the front porch were heavy and deliberate, and I could hear him fumbling with his keys before the door opened with its familiar creak. "Mary? James?" his voice called out, and I noticed the slight relief in his tone when he spotted us in the living room. At 35, my brother had always carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged in the world. But today, he looked tired, older somehow, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. His usually perfectly pressed shirt was wrinkled, and his hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it all morning. Whatever was weighing on his mind, it was taking a visible toll on him. "I brought coffee," John announced, holding up a cardboard tray from the diner down the street, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thought we could all use some caffeine while we tackle this project." The way he said project made it sound like we were renovating a kitchen rather than sorting through the belongings of the woman who had raised us after our parents died. Grandma had been more than a grandmother to us. She'd been our anchor, our safe harbor in a world that had suddenly become uncertain and frightening. The fact that John could reduce her memory to a simple task felt like a betrayal, and I found myself studying his face, looking for some sign of the brother I used to know. As John distributed the coffee cups, I noticed the way he and James exchanged a look, quick, almost imperceptible, but loaded with meaning. It was the kind of silent communication that comes from shared secrets, from knowing something that others don't. I'd seen that same look pass between them at Grandma's funeral when I'd suggested we all spend some time going through her things together. "That's not necessary," John had said quickly, too quickly. "I can handle it." But here I was anyway, because something deep in my gut told me that my family was hiding something from me, and I'd learned the hard way that ignoring my instincts was a luxury I couldn't afford. The coffee was bitter and too strong, but I wrapped my hands around the warm cup anyway, grateful for something to do with my nervous energy. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice light and conversational, "what's the plan for today? Should we start upstairs with the bedrooms, or maybe tackle the study first?" I watched their faces carefully as I spoke, noting the way James's shoulders tensed, and how John's grip tightened on his coffee cup. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap, and I could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing down on all of us. Whatever they were hiding, it was eating them alive from the inside out. "Actually," John said finally, clearing his throat, "I was thinking you could focus on the main floor today, the bedrooms and the study. James and I can handle the other areas." The way he hesitated before saying other areas sent another chill down my spine. In all our years growing up in this house, there had never been any other areas that were off limits to any of us. We'd been a family that shared everything: meals, stories, secrets, sorrows. But now, standing in Grandma's living room with my brother and cousin, I felt like an outsider looking in, like there was an invisible wall between us that I couldn't see but could definitely feel. The realization that the two people I trusted most in the world were keeping something from me hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and confused. The morning dragged on with an uncomfortable rhythm as we worked in different parts of the house, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of boxes being moved or drawers being opened. I found myself in Grandma's bedroom, carefully folding her clothes and trying not to think about how they still smelled like her perfume. White shoulders, the same scent she'd worn for as long as I could remember. Each piece of clothing told a story: the blue dress she'd worn to my high school graduation, the soft cardigan she'd wrapped around my shoulders during my divorce proceedings, the Sunday best outfit she'd saved for church and special occasions. But even surrounded by these tangible memories of the woman who had loved us unconditionally, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my family's dynamic. Every few minutes, I could hear John and James moving around downstairs, their voices too low for me to make out actual words, but urgent enough to confirm my suspicions that they were discussing something they didn't want me to hear. The old house carried sound in strange ways. Sometimes you could hear a whisper from 3 rooms away. Other times you couldn't hear someone calling your name from the next room. But the tone of their conversation was unmistakable. They were planning something, coordinating their efforts to keep me away from whatever secret they were guarding. The knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. Around noon, John appeared in the doorway with a forced smile and an announcement that made my blood run cold. "Hey, Mary, I need to run some errands. Bank stuff, you know how it is with estates." His explanation came out too quickly, too rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it in his head. "James is going to stay here and help you with the heavy lifting. I should be back in a couple of hours." The way he avoided my eyes as he spoke reminded me of the time he'd lied to Grandma about breaking her garden gnome, and I felt that familiar twist of betrayal in my chest. My brother, who had never been able to lie convincingly even as a child, was standing in our grandmother's bedroom and lying to my face. "Bank stuff on a Saturday?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, but John was already backing out of the room, his keys jingling in his hand like he couldn't wait to escape. "Some things can't wait," he called over his shoulder, and then I heard his footsteps hurrying down the stairs, followed by the slam of the front door and the sound of his car starting up. The sudden silence that followed felt oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stood there among Grandma's belongings, feeling more alone than I had since the day she died, wondering when my family had become strangers to me and why I was the only one who seemed to notice. James appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, looking even more uncomfortable than before, if that was possible. "So," he said, shoving his hands deep in his pockets, "John thought maybe we could order some lunch. There's that Chinese place that delivers, remember? We used to get takeout from there when we were kids." His attempt at normalcy felt forced and desperate, like he was trying to recreate happier times to distract from whatever was happening in the present. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting toward the stairs, and I knew that food was the last thing on his mind. He was babysitting me, making sure I stayed put while John was gone, and the realization made me feel like a child being managed by adults who thought they knew what was best for me. "That sounds fine," I said, forcing a smile of my own. "But first I want to grab something from the kitchen. I'm getting a headache, and I think Grandma kept some aspirin in the drawer by the sink." It wasn't entirely a lie. My head was pounding from the stress and confusion of the day, but it was also an excuse to get closer to the basement door. James's face went pale at my words, and he practically jumped in front of me as I moved toward the stairs. "I'll get it for you," he said quickly, his voice cracking slightly. "You just stay here and rest. I'll bring you some water too." The desperation in his voice was so obvious that it would have been almost comical if it weren't so frightening. "James," I said, stopping in the middle of the hallway and turning to face him directly, "what is in that basement?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I watched as a dozen different emotions flickered across his face: fear, guilt, panic, and something that looked almost like grief. For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me the truth, might finally explain why my family was treating me like an outsider in my own grandmother's house. But then his expression hardened, and he shook his head with a finality that made my heart sink. "Nothing," he said, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "There's nothing down there that you need to see." The way he said "need to see" rather than "want to see" sent another wave of chills through me, because it implied that there was definitely something to see, something that he and John had decided I was better off not knowing about. Standing there in the hallway where I'd played as a child, where I'd felt safe and loved and protected, I realized that my family had made a decision about my life without consulting me. They had looked at whatever truth was hidden in that basement and decided that I was too fragile, too innocent, or too something to handle it. The patronizing nature of their protection felt like a slap in the face, and for the first time since arriving at the house, I felt anger beginning to burn through my confusion and hurt. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows at a different angle when James finally relaxed his vigilant watch over me. He'd been hovering like a nervous mother hen for the past 2 hours, finding excuses to check on me every few minutes and making sure I stayed well away from the kitchen and its forbidden basement door. But even the most dedicated guard dog eventually needs a break, and when his phone rang with what sounded like an urgent call from his girlfriend, I saw my opportunity. "I need to take this," he said apologetically, glancing at the caller ID. "It's Sarah, and she's been having problems with her car all week. I'll just be a few minutes." He stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the door closed behind him, and I could hear his voice through the window as he launched into a detailed discussion about alternators and brake pads. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure James would be able to hear it from outside as I crept down the hallway toward the kitchen. Every floorboard seemed to creak louder than usual. Every shadow seemed deeper and more ominous than it had that morning. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it always had. The same yellow wallpaper with tiny daisies that Grandma had put up in the 70s, the same white cabinets with their slightly warped doors, the same linoleum floor that had seen decades of family meals and midnight snacks. But now, standing in front of the basement door, everything felt different, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. The door itself was nothing special, just plain white wood with a brass knob that had been turned by countless hands over the years. I could still hear James's voice from the porch, animated and distracted as he explained something about transmission fluid to Sarah, and I knew this might be my only chance to discover what my family was so desperate to hide from me. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, and for a moment I hesitated, wondering if maybe James and John were right. Maybe there were some truths that were better left buried. But then I thought about the way they'd looked at me, like I was a child who couldn't handle adult realities, and my resolve hardened. I was 32 years old, a mother, a survivor of divorce and heartbreak and loss. Whatever was down there, I had the right to know about it, especially if it involved my family. The door opened with a soft click, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness below. The smell that wafted up from the basement was musty and stale, tinged with something else that I couldn't quite identify, something that made my stomach clench with unease. I fumbled along the wall until I found the light switch, and the bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered to life, casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls. The stairs themselves looked solid enough, despite James's claims about rot and structural damage, and I began my descent slowly, testing each step before putting my full weight on it. With every step downward, the temperature seemed to drop, and I found myself shivering despite my sweater. The basement was larger than I remembered from childhood, stretching back under the entire house with low ceilings and exposed beams that created a maze of shadows and hidden corners. Most of the space was filled with the usual basement detritus: old furniture covered with sheets, boxes of Christmas decorations, a workbench that Grandpa had used for his woodworking projects. But there was something else, something that didn't belong with the innocent accumulation of family memories. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, I could see what looked like a newer section of concrete flooring, a patch that was slightly different in color and texture from the rest of the basement floor. The sight of it made my mouth go dry with a fear I couldn't name. As I moved closer to investigate, my foot kicked something that skittered across the concrete with a metallic sound. I looked down to see a small, tarnished piece of jewelry, a woman's ring with a distinctive setting that made my blood freeze in my veins. I'd seen that ring before, in old photographs and police reports that I'd found in Grandma's papers years ago when I was researching our family history for a school project. It belonged to Margaret Sullivan, a young woman who had disappeared from our neighborhood in 1987 when I was just a baby. The case had never been solved, and Margaret's family had spent decades wondering what had happened to their daughter, their sister, their beloved girl who had simply vanished one autumn evening and never come home. The implications of finding Margaret's ring in my grandmother's basement hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grab onto the workbench to keep from falling. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to find some innocent explanation for how that ring could have ended up here. But deep down I knew there was only one reason it would be hidden in this dark corner of our family home. Someone in my family, someone I loved and trusted and had shared countless meals and holidays with, was responsible for Margaret Sullivan's disappearance. The knowledge felt like poison spreading through my veins, contaminating every happy memory I had of this house, of my family, of the people who had raised me and shaped me into the woman I had become. I could hear James's voice getting louder outside, which meant his phone call was probably ending, but I couldn't seem to move from where I stood frozen beside that patch of newer concrete. In my hand, Margaret's ring felt impossibly heavy, like it contained the weight of all the years her family had spent wondering and hoping and grieving. Above me, I could hear footsteps on the kitchen floor. James was back inside, probably looking for me, probably panicking when he realized I wasn't where he'd left me. "Mary?" his voice called out, and I could hear the fear in it, the desperate edge that confirmed everything I'd just discovered. My family wasn't just hiding a secret from me, they were hiding a crime, and now I was standing in the middle of it with evidence in my hand and nowhere to run. "Mary!" James's voice echoed through the house above me, getting closer to the kitchen with each passing second, and I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before he discovered me in the basement with Margaret's ring clutched in my trembling hand. The weight of the decision I had to make felt crushing. Do I confront my family with this evidence and destroy everything I thought I knew about the people I loved? Or do I pretend I never found it and live with this terrible knowledge eating away at my soul? As his footsteps reached the kitchen floor directly above my head, I made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I slipped the ring into my pocket and quickly climbed the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. When I emerged from the basement, James was standing by the kitchen sink with his back to me, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the counter like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid in a world that had suddenly become unstable. "There you are," he said when he turned around, and I could see the relief flood his face, even as his eyes searched mine for any sign that I had discovered what I wasn't supposed to see. I forced myself to smile, to act like nothing had changed, even though everything had changed in the span of those few minutes in the basement, even though I now carried the weight of a decades-old secret that would forever alter my understanding of my family and myself. "I was just getting that aspirin," I lied, my voice somehow steady despite the chaos raging inside my head, and James nodded quickly, too quickly, like he wanted to believe me so desperately that he was willing to ignore the obvious signs that I was falling apart right in front of him. As we stood there in Grandma's kitchen, surrounded by the familiar warmth of yellow wallpaper and morning sunlight, I realized that some truths are too heavy for one person to carry alone, and that sometimes the people we love most are the ones capable of hurting us in ways we never thought possible.